Hebrew text of Matthew's Gospel.
The fifth principle of Phariseeism is very similar to number 4, and the fifth principle is the commandments of men, or enactments in Hebrew, the takanot. The takanot, that's the fifth principle of Phariseeism. Has anybody heard that word before, takanot? Is that familiar from anywhere? Yes? Okay, so let's all say that together. Takanot! Okay, so takanot, these man-made laws, and these are actually called by the rabbis, they use another term for this, mitzvot rabbanan, commandments of our rabbis. And the rabbis actually make a very clear distinction between laws that they derive from the Torah, albeit using their rational method of interpretation, and laws that they derive simply by either tradition or by a rabbinical enactment. And the truth is that sometimes they can't distinguish between whether a certain law was established by tradition, by doing it over and over, or whether it was established by the rabbi sitting down and making a new enactment. And so really those are very related and similar categories. But there's a very clear distinction between that and laws derived from the Torah, even using the rational methods of interpretation. Now, the classic example of takanot, or commandments of our rabbis, is the washing of the hands. And because the oral law gives the rabbis the absolute authority to make these new enactments, they have a divine, God-given right to make new enactments. Because of that, you make the blessing, "Blessed art thou, Lord, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments, commanding us to wash the hands." The rabbis know very well that God never commanded them to wash the hands, but what they mean by this is that God commanded you to obey the rabbis. By obeying the rabbis, you're indirectly obeying God. And this is very interesting. What this means is every time you sit down to eat a meal and wash your hands, you're actually proclaiming the God-given authority of the rabbis to make these enactments. Now, how many people are thinking here, I'm not going to do these rabbinical enactments, they're not from the Torah? How many people are thinking that? Okay, we got a good group of Pharisees here. Most people are. Okay, how many people are thinking you're not going to follow these man-made laws because they're not from the Torah? Okay, that's much better. Now, this is what the oral law says to everyone who raised their hands. It says in the Midrash, which is part of the oral law, it says, a person must not say, I will not keep the commandment of the elders because they're not from the Torah. You must not say that. The Almighty says to such a person, now they're literally putting words in God's mouth. The Almighty says to such a person, no, my son, rather all that they decree upon you observe. And then it goes on, and now it quotes Deuteronomy 17:11, as it is written, according to the instruction which they teach you. Now you could look up in Deuteronomy 17, and it's not talking about the Pharisees or rabbis. You won't see them mentioned anywhere. What it's actually talking about is the high priest at the temple and the prophetic judge. And what it talks about there is if there's a difficult court case, and the lower judges, remember Moses came along and he appointed lower judges and lower judges below them because he couldn't handle judging every matter by himself. So what it's describing in Deuteronomy 17 is if one of those lower judges comes along and says, I don't know what the law is here, or this is a difficult case, I don't know what to do, then he goes to the high judge at the temple, or to the high priest at the temple. This is not talking about the Pharisees or the rabbis, and actually in the various passages, such as in Ezra chapter 2, verse 63, it talks about an actual case they had like this, and it says there that this had to be decided by the high priest with the Urim and the Thummim, or in Hebrew, the Urim and the Tummim, which was a prophetic device that the high judge would go and ask, what is the answer? He would ask from God. He wouldn't just make it up, because God actually does have a say in how Scripture is interpreted. But the rabbis apply this to themselves, because to them, God has no say, only they have a say. And then it goes on in the Midrash, and it says, remember, God is speaking here, the Almighty. And it goes on there, and it says, even I must obey their decree. Even I, God, must obey the decrees of the rabbis. And by the way, it quotes a verse there from Job, which has nothing to do whatsoever with the authority of the rabbis or God obeying them. But the principle here is that the rabbis are given absolute authority, not only to interpret Scripture, but to make new enactments, and God himself must obey those enactments according to the oral law. Well, now that we understand Phariseeism, let's get an overview. We see these 5 principles of Phariseeism, and the first principle is the concept of the 2 Torahs, the written Torah and the oral Torah. Then we have the authority of the rabbis, the absolute authority of the rabbis to interpret Scripture. God has no say in it, only the rabbis do. Irrational or midrashic interpretation, Scripture is a divine code, and things can be taken out of context. Sanctified tradition, such as the kippah, and the takanot, or commandments of men, such as the washing of the hands. Now, it was very interesting. I was giving this talk about a week ago, and afterwards a woman walked up to me and she said, Nehemiah, when you were talking about the 5 principles of Phariseeism, you didn't really mean the Pharisees. You really meant my denomination of Christianity, right? And I said to her, I'm talking about what I know from my firsthand experience. I don't really know anything about your denomination of Christianity, but if the shoe fits. Just make sure to put on the right shoe first.
But don't tie it. Okay.
Now that we understand Phariseeism, what we need to do is go back to Matthew 15 and see if we can understand what's happening. The Pharisees come along and say to Yeshua, your disciples are transgressing the tradition of the elders because they don't wash their hands before they eat, which is that ritual we saw before. What is exactly going on there? There in verse 3, Yeshua says to the Pharisees, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? So how do the Pharisees transgress the commandment of God by their tradition? How is the Pharisee tradition a transgression of the commandment of God? They're adding to the Torah. Deuteronomy 4:2, Deuteronomy 12:32, and Proverbs 30 verse 6 forbid us to add to the Torah. And by adding these laws to the Torah, this commandment to wash the hands, it's a transgression of the commandment of God. Yeshua goes on in verse 6, and he says to the Pharisees, thus have you made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. How did the Pharisees make the commandment of God of none effect? This is something that I see every day in modern day Israel. I see it all the time. One of the things that most people are surprised at when they come to Israel for the first time is that most Jews in Israel do not observe the Sabbath. Most people, when they come to Israel, are shocked to see that. And if you ask the average Israeli, why don't you keep the Sabbath? He'll respond and tell you it's impossible to keep the Sabbath. And I respond, okay, I've been keeping the Sabbath my whole life. Why is it impossible? And he'll tell you, well, if I keep the Sabbath, I have to do this and I have to do that. And I can't do this and I can't do that. And every single thing he lists is something, these man-made traditions and laws that the Pharisees have foisted upon the nation, these heavy burdens they've loaded up upon the nation, and the average person can't always distinguish between what has the Creator commanded us and what are these man-made laws that the Pharisees have commanded. And because of that, they just completely give up and say, okay, I just can't do it. They give up, and by requiring these man-made laws, the Pharisees have made the commandment of God of none effect. They've made it impossible to keep the Torah. Now, I've been keeping the Sabbath my whole life, and I know from firsthand experience that it's a pleasure to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a delight. It's only when you add all these man-made laws and rules and regulations, then it becomes impossible to keep and it becomes a burden. And this is how the Pharisees make the commandment of God of none effect. Well, what we can see here very clearly in Matthew 15 is Yeshua is warning his disciples not to follow the man-made laws of the Pharisees. You must not follow the man-made laws. He goes on in verse 7. This is a very interesting passage, and he says, you hypocrites, speaking to the Pharisees, you hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you saying. And now he quotes Isaiah 29 verse 13. This people draws near unto me with their mouth and honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Well, now we know what he's talking about, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. That is Phariseeism with their oral law and their man-made authority to interpret Scripture even above that of God, and their takanot and their sanctified traditions. That's teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Now, when I saw this, when I first read this, I was very intrigued for a different reason that you're so intrigued by it. And I was intrigued by this because Matthew 15:9 is actually a paraphrase of Isaiah 29:13. Isaiah 29:13 actually speaks about, in Hebrew, mitzvat anashim melumada, which is translated variously as a learned commandment of men or a commandment of men learned by rote, or some variation of that translation. And the reason I was so intrigued by this is that I knew that throughout history, Karaite Jews, strictly Old Testament Tanach following Jews, have always quoted these verses from the moment that Phariseeism was invented, have always quoted Isaiah 29:13 in reference to the Pharisees. And I thought this was very interesting that Yeshua was applying the same exact verse to the Pharisees back in the first century. And back when I was sitting with my Torah-keeping Christian friend, I said to him, almost thinking out loud, I said, you know, Yeshua really sounds to me like a Karaite. And I asked him what he thought of that. And at first he was very offended, and he said, no, Karaites, that's some Jewish sect from the Middle Ages, and Yeshua wasn't part of that, and you're trying to take him over. And I could see he didn't really understand what this Hebrew word Karaite meant. And so I explained to him that actually the word Karaite comes from the Hebrew word kara, which is the ancient Hebrew word for the Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament. And many of you may know the modern Hebrew word Tanach. Tanach is an acronym which stands for the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. And that's a word that's only been used in the last few hundred years. The ancient Hebrew word for Scripture is kara, and the variation of that is mikra, which is still used today in Israel, kara or mikra. And if kara, meaning Hebrew scriptures, someone who follows the Hebrew scriptures is called a Karaite or a Karaite. Kara is Hebrew scriptures or Old Testament. A follower of the Old Testament is a Karaite. Now, earlier I explained to you that as a Karaite, I only believe in the Old Testament. And you probably thought, don't all Jews just believe in the Old Testament? Now you know that many Jews today actually believe in the oral Torah. And when I say I'm a Karaite, that means I only believe in the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanach, the Kara, the Old Testament, and not in the oral Torah that the Pharisees have invented. Now the term Karaite was used throughout history very often to distinguish those that followed the Hebrew scriptures from the Talmudists, who, that is the rabbis or the Pharisees, the Talmudists. Once the Talmud was written down, in around the year 500 of the Common Era, it began to be disseminated throughout the Jewish world, and many Jews embraced it and declared that they were followers of Talmudists, and other Jews said, Talmud, oral law, what's that? Our ancestors only knew about Kara, we are Karaites. And that's what the term means. And when I said that Yahshua sounded like a Karaite, what I meant is that he seemed to be telling people to return to the Torah and not follow these man-made laws of the Pharisees. Now that we understand Matthew 15, we really have a problem, don't we? Or actually, I don't have a problem, but you really have a problem. Because Matthew 15, Yahshua is very clearly warning his disciples not to follow the man-made laws and traditions of the Pharisees. But in Matthew 23, he says they have Mosaic authority. The Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses. Whatsoever they command you to do, that observe and do. So what's going on here? Matthew 15 very clearly is contradicting Matthew 23, the way it reads in the English. Well, when I first began to research this question, my first thing that I did is I looked in the Greek, and I saw that the Greek says the exact same thing as the English. Didn't really help me. And at this point, I was pretty much out of ideas. And I went to a colleague of mine at the Hebrew University where I was studying, and he was a big expert in New Testament studies, and I said, can you point me in some direction here? Give me some kind of indication of how I should proceed to try and solve this problem. And he began to explain to me that according to some scholars, the New Testament wasn't written in Greek, it was actually written in Hebrew. I thought that was very interesting, and I said, Hebrew? Why would you think the New Testament was written in Hebrew? And he explained to me that in certain parts of the New Testament, you have something which are called Hebraisms. Hebraisms are Hebrew thought patterns which are literally translated over into Greek, and when you read them in Greek, they sound like broken Greek. They sound like they were translated by a foreigner. It doesn't make sense. And let me illustrate to you what a Hebraism is by bringing you an Anglicism or an Anglicism. In English, we have an expression, dead as a doornail. Now imagine if I translated the phrase dead as a doornail into Chinese, and the Chinaman would come along and read, dead as a doornail? How dead is a doornail? What is that? It doesn't mean anything in Chinese, at least as far as I know from Chinese, but it certainly doesn't mean anything in Hebrew. And that's what a Hebraism is, these expressions and thought patterns that are translated over into Greek, and they make no sense in Greek. And what that means is you can read certain parts of the New Testament and see that they're clearly translated from another language, from Hebrew. Well, I began to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and Revelations in Greek, and I could see, yes, they're full of these Hebraisms. They sound like they were translated from Hebrew, and I wasn't really clear how this helped me, though, with Matthew 23. Okay, so let's say these books were written in Hebrew. Here's the standard grammar of New Testament Greek, Blass and de Brunner. This is the grammar used in every seminary in the world, the standard grammar of New Testament Greek. And there it says, many expressions which a Greek would not have used, such as dead as a doornail, many expressions which a Greek would not have used were bound to creep into a faithful written translation of a Semitic original. So it's universally recognized by scholars that certain parts of the New Testament were written in a Semitic language and then translated into Greek. And the debates that go on between scholars is which parts of the New Testament and how much, and what was that Semitic language? Was it Aramaic or was it Hebrew? That's something I'll touch upon a little bit at the end, the question of Aramaic. But it's universally recognized that certain parts of the New Testament were written in a foreign language and translated. And as I was studying this, I saw, okay, we have these Hebraisms, and I'm reading the New Testament in Greek, and I went back to my colleague at the university, and I said, how did this help me? This is a very interesting homework assignment you gave me, but how did this help me? Ooh, how did that get in there? That's actually a picture of my dog, and I thought this would be a good place to insert some comic relief in the middle of this intensive linguistic discussion. But basically, that's the look I had on my face when I was I'm like, how does this help me? And she really has nothing to do with the story other than that she's extremely beautiful. And I'm looking at him and I'm saying, okay, Matthew 23, what does this have to do with it being written in Hebrew? It doesn't help me. I don't have the Hebrew. And he said, oh, Nehemiah, I forgot to tell you the most important part. What's the most important he forgot to tell me? This most important part, that the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew has actually survived down to modern times. And that's known today as Shem-Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Shem-Tov's Hebrew Matthew is named after a rabbi who lived in 14th century Spain named Shem-Tov ibn Shaprut. And Shem-Tov ibn Shaprut lived during the Spanish Inquisition at a time that was plagued by something called the Disputations. The Disputations were public debates that were forced upon the Jews by their Catholic oppressors, and the Jews were forced to defend their religion against the Catholic religion, and it was pretty much a no-win situation for the Jews. If the Jews lost these debates, they could be forcibly converted to Catholicism. If they won the debates, they would very often have to flee town, flee Spain, because they've now insulted the Catholic religion. Well, most Jews would agree that it's better to have to flee town than to be forcibly converted to Catholicism any day of the week and twice on Sunday. And Shem-Tov ibn Shaprut sat down and said, okay, I want to win these debates, so I don't have to be a Catholic. And he sat down and he wrote a book called Even Bochan, which translates into English as the test stone, in which he systematically goes through the arguments that the Jews could use in these debates. And interestingly enough, one of his main arguments was to systematically go through the words of Yahshua and show how the Catholics don't actually follow what Yahshua said. For example, he points out in his book that Yahshua upheld the Sabbath, and he says, how come you Catholics don't keep the Sabbath? Yahshua upheld the Sabbath. At the end of his book, Shem-Tov ibn Shaprut says, if we Jews really want to win these debates, what we need to do is start reading the New Testament. And at the end of his book, he includes an appendix, which was the Gospel of Matthew, of course, in Hebrew, because the whole book is in Hebrew. And because this was included as an appendix to the test stone, this became known as Shem-Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Now, Shem-Tov's Hebrew Matthew was known for centuries by Hebrew scholars. However, it was simply assumed that Shem-Tov had translated his Matthew from Greek into Hebrew. That was just an assumption, and scholars never even bothered reading this book. They just assumed, because they assumed it was translated from Greek and that it wasn't really important. In the 1980s, a series of linguistic studies were carried out, and they found that Shem-Tov's Hebrew Matthew actually has certain characteristics which make it sound like this book wasn't translated from Greek, but actually that it was written in Hebrew. And one of the main characteristics that you find in Shem-Tov's Hebrew Matthew are what are known as Hebrew word puns. A Hebrew word pun is when you take two similar sounding Hebrew words, use them with different meanings in the same passage, and that creates a beautiful poetical style and a flow to the passage. And every ancient document written in Hebrew has these Hebrew word puns. The question is, though, what are they doing in a book that's supposedly translated from Greek? Well, first let's look at some examples of Hebrew word puns. The Tanach, the Old Testament, is full of Hebrew word puns. Literally every page of the Tanakh has Hebrew word puns. For example, in chapter 2, it says, the first man was called Adam, and it says he was taken from the ground, Adamah. Adamah, man, ground. That's a classic Hebrew word pun, two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. When you read it in Hebrew, it flows and it's beautiful, and it makes perfect sense. Another Hebrew word pun appears at the end of Genesis 2. It says, the man and his wife were naked. Naked in Hebrew is arumim. In the very next verse, it says, the snake was clever. Clever in Hebrew is arum. Arumim, arum, two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, in these last two examples, the Hebrew word pun really is just brought in to beautify the text, to make it flow and sound poetic. Sometimes, though, the Hebrew word pun is intricately interwoven into the actual message of Scripture. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 1, we read, and the word of Yehovah came to me saying, what do you see, Jeremiah? And I said, I see an almond branch. And Yehovah said to me, you have seen well, for I am diligent to do my word. Now, when you read this in English, it makes absolutely no sense. What is the almond branch doing there? It's like a red herring. What is that almond branch doing in the prophecy? What does it have to do with diligence? Well, in Hebrew, it's immediately obvious, because almond is shaked, and diligent is shoked. Shoked, two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Well, of course, Genesis and Jeremiah have Hebrew word puns. They were written in Hebrew. But what they found is that Shem-Tov's Hebrew Matthew also has Hebrew word puns. For example, and we're just going to bring a few examples, but there are many, many examples. Matthew chapter 9, verse 8, and the crowd saw and they feared very much. Now, when you read this in English, you say, okay, what's the word pun? But in Hebrew, it's immediately obvious. And they saw as vayiru, and they feared as vayiru, two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. This is a classic Hebrew word pun. But what is this doing in a book that was supposed to be translated from Greek? It shouldn't be there, should it? Here's another one, Matthew 12, verse 13. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he stretched out his hand, and it was after this that Yeshua knew and he turned. Okay, again, in English, what's the word pun? You don't see anything. In Hebrew, it's immediately obvious. Vayet, and he stretched. Vayet, and he turned. It's two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings, a classic Hebrew word pun. What is this doing in a book that was supposed to be translated from Greek, though? You would only have these Hebrew word puns if this was written in Hebrew. Here's another example, which is very interesting. Here in Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 to 35, we have the parable of the debt. And this is the famous parable which talks about a king who's owed a debt by his servant, and that servant can't pay, so he goes down the food chain and oppresses his own servant. And 5 times in the parable it talks about paying. It says to pay 5 times. Pay, 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 pay. The Hebrew word for pay is shalem. So 5 times in the Hebrew it says shalem. Shalem, 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 shalem. Let's all learn that Hebrew word. What's the Hebrew word? Shalem. So 5 times it says to shalem, to pay. Then in the moral of the parable appears in verse 35, and there Yeshua says, so shall my Father in heaven do if you do not forgive each man his brother with a complete heart. And the Hebrew word for complete is shalem. Now, this is a classic Hebrew word pun that, just like in the example of Jeremiah, is intricately interwoven into the actual message of the parable. And without recognizing this Hebrew word pun, you're missing something. It's like the almond branch. You don't understand the connection there. In Hebrew, you immediately see the connection. He says it 5 times, and the 6th time it has a different meaning. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, it's very clear that this parable must have been spoken in Hebrew, because this Hebrew word pun is intricately interwoven into the actual parable. So if this was translated from Greek, that would be an impossible coincidence. And you have many Hebrew word puns like this in Shem-Tov's Hebrew Matthew. We only looked at a few examples. Here's a word pun that actually appears in Greek Matthew 16:18. Yeshua says to Shimon, to Peter, he says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And this is a Greek word pun that appears in the Greek Gospel of Matthew. And based on this verse, many scholars have argued that this is definitive proof that Matthew wrote the Gospel actually in Greek. Matthew didn't write in Hebrew. He must have written in Greek because there's a word pun in the actual Greek text. Now, we've already seen 3 word puns in the Hebrew, and that's just a very small sampling. There's only 1 word pun in the entire Greek text. Now, let's look at the Hebrew and see what it says there. In Hebrew, Matthew 16:18, it says, you are a stone, and I will build my house of prayer upon you. Now, if you read this in Hebrew, you immediately see there's a word pun in the Hebrew. Because stone is even, I will build is evneh, even, evneh, stone, I will build. That's a classic Hebrew word pun, 2 similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, if this verse was a definitive proof that Matthew wrote the gospel in Greek, well, the very same verse has a word pun in Hebrew. So that proof falls away.